In this recording, I'm just going to discuss the system used by John Taylor to produce his interlinear texts, Aesop's Fables, as romanized by Phædrus, with a literal interlinear translation. And we're going to look at the preface and introduction, accompanied by illustrative notes on the plan recommended by Mr. Locke. This is the philosopher John Locke. 5th edition, London, printed for John Taylor, bookseller and publisher to the University of London, 30 Upper Gower Street, 1834. Preface. When Mr. Locke prepared an interlinear translation for the help of those that have a mind to understand Latin books, he did not mean that the aid of grammar was to be despised, but merely that the young student should not be disgusted by the formal rules of grammar before he had acquired some interest in the object of his studies. He says expressly, "It will help to facilitate the learning of the Latin if he that reads these fables with that design," in other words, with that intention, "will every now and then read the declensions of the Latin nouns and pronouns, and the conjugation of the verbs in the accidents, etc." Having made but one interlinear translation, he was, of course, obliged to use the same book both as a synthetical and analytical companion. But for the sake of clearer distinction, we prefer assigning different departments to a plurality of authors. Accordingly, we confine the reader of the Fables of Phædrus to the earlier acquirement, deferring the process of analysis to the part devoted to the first book of Virgil's Aeneid. And in like manner, the more advanced stages of scholarship will be severally committed to the direction of separate classics of the highest character. This mention of Locke's interlinear translation leads us to say a few words on the particular book which he adopted for that purpose nearly 2 centuries back, entitled Aesop's Fables, English and Latin. The origin of this Latin version of Aesop's Fables is very questionable. It was most probably written by some monk in the Dark Ages, and its numerous barbarisms would tend rather to corrupt than to refine the taste of the classic student. But at the time when Locke made this translation, it was far more requisite to establish the general principle of the method than to furnish an unexceptionable specimen of the details of the plan. The mind of this great philosopher was chiefly devoted to metaphysics, and he does not appear to have given exclusive attention to classical learning as an ultimate object. Perhaps, on this very account, he was better capable of forming general notions on the subject, and it was doubtless as much in consideration of general utility as in conformity to the usage of schools in his own time that he adopted a work which would fix the attention of the youthful student by its easy and familiar matter, though not recommendable as a model of Latinity. The same motive for selection can scarcely be alleged at the present day, and it certainly cannot be supported on the same ground. These dead letters have, in great measure, ceased to be practically useful, except insofar as they infuse into modern style a purity and elegance of word and thought, except insofar as they enable us to wake into new life and hold sweet converse with the great of old, the dead but sceptred monarchs, who still rule our spirits from their urns. These advantages may yet be derived from the study of classical writings, and with this view we scrupulously confine our volumes to the illustration of received authorities. The general character of the writings of Phædrus is too well known and approved to require many observations in this place on his matter or his manner. Our fabulist professes himself a Thracian by birth, but it may safely be presumed that he came early to Rome on the internal evidence afforded by the purity of his Latinity, which is scarcely consistent with a provincial education. In worldly station, he was not far removed from his famous original Aesop, the Phrygian slave, being himself a freedman of Augustus Caesar. And it is probable, from some of his own prefatory notices, that this similarity of condition had some influence in directing his genius to the same subject. He was not, however, a homely translator of the Greek fables, nor even a servile imitator. For, although the comparatively early age wherein he lived afforded facilities for collecting the genuine remains of Aesop, which modern times unhappily cannot command, Phædrus does not scruple to vary the detail of many fables, acknowledged to belong to the old man, and even to add some exclusively his own, when desirous to enforce a moral not illustrated by Aesop. Thus, in his prologue to the second book, he cries us mercy for this license, and on such a plea as to deserve it well. Equidemnia cura morem servarbo senis, sed si liburit taliquid interponere diversum sensus ut delectet varietas bonas in partes lector accipias velim. In fact, Phædrus may almost be considered as an original author, though he only claims the praise of an actor. Et in coturnis prodit Aesopus novis. At any rate, the free adaptation of his recognized exemplar to the national character of the Romans, including his frequent allusion to forms and customs unknown to the Greeks, seems to justify our titular description that the fables are not verbally Latinized, but essentially Romanized. In short, his own defense might be given in these words: that I have ta'en away this old man's daughter. It is most true, true I have married her. The very head and front of my offending hath this extent, no more. We fear we cannot offer so satisfactory an apology for the liberties we have taken with the legitimate offspring of Phædrus himself, it is therefore necessary to dwell on our own unvarnished tale somewhat more explicitly. And firstly, for the first count, we have not distributed these fables into 5 distinct books, according to the arrangement of our author, who produced the several parts at different intervals of time. This formal discrepancy will scarcely require further notice in the case of a translation, as there is in the original no exclusive classification of materiel for these particular divisions. Again, we have not included all the fables in this publication. This partial omission has been made not from any disregard to the merits of all, but with a view to the consistency of our plan. Our volume, being intended as a purely elementary work, would seem to claim some adaptation to the capacity of parties who are naturally confined to the elements of learning. We mean to the ability of the youthful novice in classical literature. For this purpose, it is expedient that the subject be of such a nature as to attract and fix the attention of the schoolboy. And we have therefore omitted those fables whose purport is not brought home to a simple apprehension by the medium of familiar or sensible objects. Some fables have also been excluded, as involving a moral inference less practically useful or important. And some few have likewise been omitted, whose moral, though valuable, had been clearly illustrated by a preceding story of similar tendency. Lastly, we have passed over in the text those additaments to each fable, which go to demonstrate the application of the story, commonly distinguished by the title of the moral. This will seem to all a very serious omission, but we hope it is not indefensible. Without questioning the delicacy of dictating any application of a fable, whose form was first assumed in order to disguise offensive truths, it may be satisfactory to state that the moral applications, which Phædrus has prefixed or subjoined, are not only less attractive in matter to the young learner, but are often so obscure in form that their sense could scarcely be comprehended by anyone not perfectly acquainted with Roman phraseology. Besides this reason for omission, the tedious sameness of the introductory lines, which are repeated almost word for word, seems to justify the course we have adopted. We have, however, taken care to give the substance of this appendage in a simple English sentence prefixed to each fable, and in some few instances have ventured, for the sake of perspicuity, slightly to vary the expression of the text. Much practical advantage may be derived from the reading of a very simple fable. And on this ground, we would advise the youthful student to recollect illustrations of these stories from observation or from history, according to the rational end proposed by Phædrus himself. Quod prudenti vitam consilio monet. A detail of omissions is at best an ungrateful oblation, but we would fain hope for absolution at the hands of an impartial confessor, every line that Phædrus ever wrote must be valuable to the scholar. But our elementary volume is not intended for the scholar. Although even here, as in more advanced parts of our series, we shall duly appreciate his criticism, we must beg to be allowed to preserve consistency of method in preference to all other considerations. This much being premised of the negative characteristics of the work, it remains that we give some account of its positive pretensions. With respect to the English translation, the first impression will probably be general, that the diction is inelegant. This we readily allow, and proceed forthwith to justification. We have endeavoured, in these pages, to avoid all attempt at supporting one language by the sacrifice of another, and have considered that an elementary work professing to teach the Latin language should be free from any shackles which its subsequent relation to the English language might possibly impose. It has therefore been our object in this volume to exhibit the character of the ancient Latin without regard to the idiom of more modern forms of speech. Language, though subject to some tyrannous laws in the school of the grammarian, obtains, by the judgment of the philosopher, an unqualified immunity from all arbitrary and irrational impositions. On this ground, we might submit that whenever the phrase of the translation conformed to the idiom of the original may appear remote from modern use, the claims of the two conflicting forms should be rationally examined, instead of one being hastily condemned because its pretensions are hitherto unknown. We do not here, however, dwell upon this consideration. It is sufficient for our purpose if the English version we have given faithfully reflects the Latin, which we profess to represent. It is easy to translate Low Latin at once literally and intelligibly, and this is probably the reason why certain well-meaning people evince so strong a partiality for writings of this age and mark, unless perchance they choose them in the innocence of ignorance. But it is by no means easy to translate a pure classic author at the same time, closely and elegantly. The different idioms of ancient and modern languages, which sometimes can scarcely be reconciled by any compromise, require the nicest discrimination. In the assignment of equivalent expressions. Hence, some others of our modern adventurers have started with declaring that the idiom of the Latin differs so widely from that of the English language as to render it impossible for us to translate the former into the latter literally and intelligibly by one process. We can easily believe, from the specimen which follows, this candid declaration, that they are perfectly sincere in their confession. But we are really surprised that they should fancy the plan which they have substituted would render the Latin any more intelligible. We must beg to differ in opinion from this sweeping enunciation, exactly in the same ratio that a particular exception differs from a universal proposition. We do not deny that there are certain idioms in any one language which could not be faithfully represented in another. But we must think that this assumed impossibility is too scanty a cloak to disguise the incapacity of the translator throughout the whole misrepresentation of his author. With regard to the closeness of our version, we submit it to the scholar without any qualification as being quite as literal as the aforesaid verbatim translation, which is confused to be unintelligible, and we submit it to the candour of the general reader to decide whether there is one fable or period which is not comprehensible. When we speak of literal translation, we do not refer to that scholastic ingenuity which would render every Latin word by some quaint English term containing an equal and similar quantity of orthodox letters. We mean that we give the true import of each original Latin word by an English equivalent in force, and without distorting the forms of the Latin, we give the sense, the whole sense, and nothing but the sense, which is conveyed in the words of our text. And on this point, we are not afraid to meet the verdict of any sensible jury. On another occasion, we shall submit a more lengthened dissertation on the question of close translation. As we observe that some strange notions are vulgarly entertained respecting the extent of the restrictions it imposes, the limits of this preface scarcely allow such a diversion. We must, therefore, for the present, postulate one admission, to which we trust we could demonstrate a fair claim that in a literal version of the classics, it is not necessary that the same Latin or Greek word should always be rendered by the same English. Yet we think it must be obvious to everyone acquainted with one word more than is found in his mother language, that the terms in different languages, which correspond in one proper sense, do not always bear precisely the same extent of translation to another sense remotely analogous. Thus, in reading any Latin author, we constantly find that his language requires adaptation to our own idiom, and that the same word, which in a former sentence appeared to be fully represented by one particular English, admits in the next a latitude of signification which that English could never comprehend. Perhaps no Latin author exemplifies this remark more clearly than Phædrus, who on this account is one of the most difficult Roman classics for an English translation. The purely classical sense in which his phraseology must be understood frequently offers violence to the prejudice of those who, from recognizing a close analogy among many modern tongues, expect that all languages must faithfully resemble one another in form, like the same object observed with prisms of a different color. Besides this refinement of expression, Phædrus is often sufficiently untractable from the conciseness of his style. Indeed, he appears to have been censured on this score by some of his contemporaries, unless he means to record a compliment paid to himself by subjoining these words to one of his longer stories. Haec executus sum propteria pluribus, brevitate nimia, quaniam quostam offendimus. We have, however, taken care to obviate these difficulties with a view to the specific purpose of this part of our series. The design of this elementary part is to give the younger learner a familiar acquaintance with the general meaning of Latin words and their inflections, without supposing the previous knowledge of grammatical distinctions. The praxis required is detailed in our introduction to parsing lessons to Virgil's Aeneid, where we speak of the first passage through the interlinear translation, and is comprised in the mere technical association of the meaning of single Latin and English words. We have therefore endeavoured as far as possible to appropriate one English to one Latin term, to be modified hereafter according to special combinations, though we do not acknowledge the essential importance of this uniformity in every literal translation. This confinement must, of course, occasion apparent awkwardness of expression in some passages, but we have not regarded such appearance in the present version. On the contrary, we have ventured to sacrifice all neatness of expression in our own language for the preservation of a faithful reflection of the original Latin. And we trust we need not apologize to the classical tourist for adopting such a course, if it is indeed more interesting to the intelligent traveller to compare the scenery of a foreign clime with that of his own country, than to have the same view perpetually before his eyes, though the new road may be less smooth or less secure. The notes which have been here subjoined have in like manner been accommodated to the information of our hospes in literarum regione. Minute and critical discussion has been as far as possible avoided in this elementary volume, and without dwelling on minor distinctions of grammar, it has been our chief object to point out the leading and essential characteristics of the Latin language, to enlarge on the remote capabilities of such a subject matter before clearly developing its general nature and properties, appears as adverse to the philosophy of learning as it would be outrageous to the rules of art to shade and colour the first sketched figure of a picture before one half of the group was distinctly designed. On this principle, all observations on nice points of etymology and construction have in great measure been omitted in this publication, and our remarks have been confined to the elucidation of those Latin idioms of speech which are least conformable to the genius of the English language. If, however, we should sometimes have been led into an allusion less obvious to the general reader, let it not be a stumbling block to retard his progress. Let him skip over it at once and return to it hereafter. It will one day be a stepping stone to scholarship. This notice extends equally to the later parts of our series, where indeed it may more frequently be applicable than in this introductory volume. But even in this place, such an intimation does not imply a departure from uniformity of design. We have indeed professed above that the present elementary work is in great measure intended for that class of readers who are entirely unacquainted with the rudiments of classic literature. And it is accordingly lowered to the easy reach of the uninitiated tyro, with a degree of adaptation which might perhaps seem overstrained to one who had forgotten that he himself was once a beginner. That it is not an impossible thing to learn a language without first beginning with the rules of grammar, we see every day by women and children's learning of the French tongue, who know not what grammar signifies. Another use, continues Locke, may be made of this translation, which is to help strangers who understand Latin to learn English. This purpose requires, if possible, still greater precision in the language of the version, the Latin being made only a third term, whereby to compare the English with another. And with such a view, we have duly considered this demand for accuracy in the present volume. But besides the tyro and the foreigner, there is still a third class of readers, by no means the least numerous, to whom we would submit both our Greek and Latin series as not unworthy of attention. There are many who have long been familiar with ancient literature without ever having known the extent of its utility and beauty, who have had the opportunities of a regular education and have been regularly defrauded of that particular introduction to the society of the classics, which is necessary to ensure a full enjoyment of the precious legacy of learning bequeathed us by antiquity. The pitiful ostentation of despatch with which the progress of raw schoolboys is early goaded on through cumbrous volumes which they never understand is the main cause, not only of the cordial disgust too often evinced towards studies which would otherwise interest and delight, but of the deplorable incapability of those nurslings of our public schools, who are commonly held forth as classical proficients. The great object seems to be to wade through as many pages as possible in a given time, and hence arises a most loose, not to say slovenly, mode of rendering Greek or Latin into English, which is seldom corrected in the later stages of education. We do not mean that we would confine the advanced student to the literarum translation we have given in this elementary volume. None can take more pleasure than ourselves in a forcible and elegant representation of the classics. And although we still must think beauty, when unadorned, adorned the most, yet there is an infinite difference between a close, transparent vest, which shows the strength and symmetry of the natural form, and a loose disguise of heavy drapery, which is rudely thrown over those limbs too finely turned for an inferior artist. To reform this counterfeit presentment of the classics is the principal object of this series of studies, and for this purpose we have endeavoured in our early parts to preserve the native characteristics of our models, even at the sacrifice of grace and harmony. It is too soon to attempt a complicated group before the proportions of a single figure are fully understood. All extraneous illustration apart, we wish first of all that the classic student should be fairly admitted to the principles of the learned languages. When this point is once gained, it will no longer be necessary to keep so closely to the letter of this text, to the detriment of its spirit. And as we proceed to those authors who are sometimes called the higher classics, we shall relax the strictness of version where it is incompatible with elegance, and shall exhibit that style of rendering the classics which is most admired in our universities. Our first offers to the public are of humble pretension, but we deprecate any hasty opinion on the effectiveness of this system before its ultimate extent is fully developed. Noli molestus esse nino litteris, maior exhibiant, ne tibi molestiam, occulis dictumst, si qui stulti nauseant, et ut putenter sapere caelum vituperant. It were superfluous to enlarge on the abstract merits of a method which we only presume to recommend so far as it shall be found practically useful. Suffice it to assure our readers, we shall endeavour to reverse the process of our emulous contemporaries. We shall endeavour, with some confidence, in the success of the attempt. Non fumum ex fulgore, sed ex fumo dare lucem.